Polly Wick had been in service at Branthwaite since she was 14 years old, and in those 9 years she had learned that a well-run household depended not on what was said, but on what was noticed. She noticed the way Mrs. Prohl counted the silver after the Countess of Farnley's visits. She noticed the way Tregear the steward kept a second ledger locked in his writing desk. And she noticed, on the morning of the 14th of October, when she lifted the Duke of Branthwaite's riding coat from the chair in the boot room to brush it before breakfast, that there was something small and hard in the left interior pocket that had not been there the day before. She might have left it. She nearly did. Her fingers had already begun working the horsehair brush across the shoulder seam when the weight shifted and the coat slipped, and a ring rolled out across the flagstones and came to rest against the leg of the boot rack with a sound like a dropped sovereign. It was a woman's ring. Gold, slender, set with a single garnet so dark it was nearly black. Not the Duchess's ring. Polly knew the Duchess's ring. She had polished the dressing table around it often enough, had watched its plain gold band catch the morning light as the Duchess turned pages at breakfast. This ring was different. It was worn, not new, not recently purchased. The inside of the band had the particular dull warmth of gold that had been pressed against skin for years. Polly held it in her palm and stared at it and felt the quiet of the boot room settle around her like held breath. She brought it to the Duchess, not to Mrs. Prohl, not to Tregear. She brought it to the Duchess directly, because Polly Wick had spent 9 years noticing things, and the thing she had noticed most carefully of all was that Dorothea Alton, Duchess of Branthwaite, was the only person in the house who could be trusted with a fact that cut. She found her in the morning room, seated at the writing desk beneath the east-facing window where the October light came in thin and gold and made the ink in the Standish gleam. The Duchess was writing a letter, her hand steady, her posture upright, her dark hair pinned in the simple arrangement she preferred, despite what the fashion plates suggested. She looked up when Polly entered, and Polly saw in that glance the particular quality that had always unsettled her about the Duchess, the sense that Dorothea Alton was already reading the shape of what you had come to say before you had opened your mouth. "Your Grace." Polly held out her hand. The ring sat in her palm like a confession. "I found this in His Grace's coat, the riding coat. It is not yours." The Duchess looked at the ring. She did not reach for it immediately. Polly watched her eyes move across it. The garnet, the worn band, the particular scratch near the setting where it had caught against something rough, a saddle perhaps, or a desk edge, or the inside of a pocket carried and worried and turned over in restless fingers, for longer than Polly wanted to calculate. Then the Duchess picked it up. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, the way one holds a letter one is not yet certain one wishes to read. She turned it once. She looked at the inside of the band. Polly saw her eyes narrow slightly, as though there were an inscription. Then she set it down on the writing desk beside her ink and folded her hands. "Thank you, Polly," she said. Her voice was exactly as it had been when she had said good morning to Mrs. Prohl in the corridor 20 minutes earlier. "That will be all." Polly curtsied and left. She closed the door behind her and stood in the corridor for a moment with her heart beating harder than it should have been, because she had seen the Duchess's hands after she folded them, and the knuckles had been white. Dorothea sat alone in the morning room for 11 minutes. She knew this because the mantel clock had read 20 past 8 when Polly left, and it read half past when she stood. In those 11 minutes she did not weep. She did not ring for anyone. She did not pick up the ring again, she thought. The ring was a woman's ring. It was not new. It had been worn regularly, worn long enough for the gold to develop that particular patina that no amount of polishing could replicate. There was an inscription inside the band, though Dorothea had not allowed herself to read it fully with Polly watching. She had seen enough, 2 letters and a date. She could not be certain of the letters, but the date, she had caught that clearly, 1811. Dorothea had married Piers Alton, Duke of Branthwaite, in the spring of 1814. Whatever this ring commemorated had preceded her by 3 years. She was not a woman given to fantasy. She did not imagine catastrophes. She assembled what she knew and waited for the rest to declare itself, the way one waits for a letter to arrive rather than riding out to meet the post. What she knew was this. Her husband carried in his coat pocket a woman's wedding ring, for it was unmistakably a wedding ring. The weight and plainness of the band were conclusive, that predated their marriage. He had not mentioned it. In 2 years of marriage, during which Dorothea had catalogued his habits with the careful attention of a woman who had been told very little and therefore resolved to learn everything, he had never once spoken of a previous attachment of any significance. This meant one of two things. Either Piers had been married before and had concealed it, or he had given a ring of such intimate weight to a woman outside marriage, which in its implications amounted to very nearly the same thing. Dorothea picked up the ring. She read the inscription. 2 initials, M.H., and the date. April 1811. Then she placed the ring in the pocket of her morning dress and went to the breakfast room. The breakfast room at Branthwaite was the most beautiful room in the house, though Dorothea suspected this was not intentional. It faced south and east, and at 8:30 in October, the light came through the tall windows in long amber shafts that caught the silver on the sideboard and turned the white linen tablecloth the color of warm cream. The room smelled of toast and coffee and the particular clean warmth of a coal fire that has been burning since 6. The table was laid for 2, as it was every morning, the Duke at the head, the Duchess to his right. Coffee for him, tea for her. The Morning Post stacked beside his plate, her correspondence beside hers, along with the household ledger Mrs. Prohl left each morning for review. Dorothea entered the room before Piers. She walked to his place at the table. She took the ring from her pocket and set it beside his coffee cup, resting against the saucer at a slight angle so that the garnet caught the light. Then she sat down in her chair, unfolded her napkin, and began to butter her toast. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, the particular stride of a man who has been riding early and changed quickly, the faint creak of boots not yet fully broken in. He was speaking to someone, Trigger perhaps, about the drainage on the south field, and his voice carried the easy authority of a man discussing a problem he believed was the most pressing matter of the morning. He came through the door. He was still speaking over his shoulder as he crossed to the table, reaching for the back of his chair with one hand, while the other gestured at a point Tregear was making about the clay subsoil. He pulled the chair out. He sat down. He saw the ring. Dorothea did not look up. She heard the sentence he had been constructing collapse somewhere between the subordinate clause and its resolution. She heard the particular silence that follows when a man's body understands something before his mind is caught up. The cessation of movement, the held breath, the faint settling of weight as every muscle that had been in casual motion arrested itself at once. She took a bite of her toast. The butter had been seasoned with salt from the Branthwaite dairy, and it was very good. Dorothea. She looked up then. She had planned to wait longer, to let the silence do the work silence did so well, but there was something in the way he said her name that she had not expected. Not guilt, precisely. Not the sharp defensive anger she had braced for. Something rawer than either. Something that looked, from where she sat with the morning light falling across the linen between them, like grief. He was staring at the ring. His coffee sat untouched. His hand had stopped halfway to the cup and remained suspended there, the fingers slightly curled, as though the ring were a small animal he was afraid of startling. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Your coat," Dorothea said. "Polly brought it to me this morning. It fell from the pocket while she was brushing it." He closed his eyes. It was a small gesture, a flicker of lids, a momentary withdrawal, but Dorothea had spent 2 years learning to read him the way she had once learned to read Latin, through patient repetition and the gradual accumulation of context. Closing his eyes was not calculation. It was not a man composing a lie. It was a man absorbing a blow he had known, somewhere beneath conscious thought, would come eventually. M.H., Dorothea said quietly. April 1811. He opened his eyes. They were very gray in the morning light, the color of the slate roofs in rain, the color of pewter, the color of the sky above the moors on the long walks she took alone when the house became too full of his absences. "Yes," he said. Dorothea set down her toast. She folded her hands in her lap. She did not ask the question that pressed against her teeth with the force of 2 years of accumulated patience. Who was she? Why did you never tell me? What am I, if not the woman who should know what that ring means? She did not ask because she understood, with the clarity that comes to those who have been underestimated all their lives, that the person who asks the question surrenders the ground. The person who waits holds it. Piers looked at the ring. He looked at his wife. He looked at the ring again. Her name was Mary Holloway, he said. The name meant nothing to Dorothea. She searched her memory. 2 years of introductions, morning calls, dinner parties, the long recitation of county families Mrs. Prohl had provided when Dorothea first arrived as a bride, and found no Holloway among them. She was the daughter of the curate at Ashfield, Piers continued. His voice had the strained evenness of a man walking on ice, each word placed carefully. I was 22. My father was alive. My brother George was the heir. I was the second son with a commission waiting and no particular expectations from anyone. He paused. Dorothea waited. We married in April of 1811, in the chapel at Ashfield, with her father officiating and her sister as witness. It was legal. It was real. And it was something my family was never told about, because a second son marrying a curate's daughter was an embarrassment, not a catastrophe, and I intended to manage it quietly once I had established myself. The morning light shifted. A cloud passed and the amber warmth of the room dimmed briefly, then returned. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house a door closed. She died, Piers said. November of 1811, 7 months after the wedding. Of fever, the same fever that took half the village that winter. I was at my posting. I received the letter 3 weeks after she was buried. Dorothea's hands remained folded. Inside the fold, her nails pressed into her palms. When George died and I inherited, the marriage was already over. She was already gone. There was no widow to present, no marriage to explain. The register at Ashfield recorded it, but no one in London knew, and by the time my mother began introducing me to suitable families, it seemed— He stopped. He pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. It seemed simpler to say nothing. Simpler, Dorothea repeated. It was the first word she had contributed to the conversation beyond what was necessary, and she let it sit between them on the tablecloth, like the ring sat beside his cup. I know what that sounds like. I think you do not. Dorothea's voice was very quiet. I think you know what it sounds like to you. A pragmatic decision, a private grief, a thing too painful to speak of and therefore left unspoken. I think you do not know what it sounds like to me. He looked at her, truly looked at her, in the way he had looked at her perhaps 3 or 4 times in the entirety of their marriage. Not the habitual glance of a husband acknowledging a wife's presence at the table, but the focused, almost startled attention of a man suddenly aware that the person across from him possesses a depth he has not troubled himself to measure. Tell me, he said. It sounds as though I married a man who had already given this ring, she said, touching the edge of the saucer where the garnet caught the light, and who carried the absence of the woman who wore it into every room of this house without once considering that the woman who replaced her deserved to know she was a replacement. You were not a replacement. Then why did I not know? The question landed cleanly. Dorothea watched it register. The flinch he could not quite suppress, the way his jaw set, the slow exhale through his nose that she had come to recognize as the sound of a man confronting a truth he had spent considerable energy avoiding. Because I was ashamed, he said. And there it was, not the grand confession she had braced for, not a mistress, not a living wife hidden in the country, not the Gothic horror her mind had assembled and then dismantled in the 11 minutes she had sat alone in the morning room. Something smaller, something in its way worse. Shame. He had been ashamed, not of Mary Holloway, not of loving her, but of the particular cowardice of having loved her inadequately, of having married her in secret because he lacked the courage to face his family, of having left her in a village while he went to his posting, of having received the letter 3 weeks too late and carrying the ring ever since as a penance he would not name. Dorothea understood all of this in the time it took the mantel clock to tick from 1 second to the next. She understood it because she had spent her life as the second daughter, the quiet one, the one who noticed, the one who was passed over in favor of her elder sister Judith's beauty and confidence, and she knew what it was to be the person in the room whose interior life was assumed to be simple because it was not performed. How long have you carried it? She asked, since the letter came. 15 years. Yes. And in 2 years of marriage to me, it did not occur to you that the woman who sleeps beside you might notice a ring in your coat, or that she might deserve to understand why her husband carries a dead woman's wedding band against his chest? He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. Dorothea stood. She did not push her chair back dramatically. She did not throw her napkin. She rose with the composed economy of movement she had perfected, a movement that gave nothing away and therefore gave everything away, because composure in the presence of injury is its own declaration, and Piers was not too proud or too stupid to understand that. "I will be in the garden," she said. "When you have decided what to do with the ring, you may come and tell me." She left the breakfast room. She walked through the corridor, past the morning room, past the library, through the garden door, and out into the October air, which was sharp and bright, and smelled of wet earth and the last of the late roses. She walked to the stone bench beneath the copper beech at the far end of the south lawn, and sat down and looked at the sky above Branthwaite, and allowed herself, for the first time that morning, to feel the full weight of what she had learned. It was not betrayal. She was clear-eyed enough to know that. A dead woman was not a rival. A secret marriage was not an affair, but it was erasure. The quiet, systematic erasure of a fact that had shaped the man she married, carried out not through malice, but through the particular selfishness of grief, which demands to be private even when its privacy inflicts a wound. She thought of her father's house in Derbyshire. She thought of Judith, beautiful, laughing Judith, who had married at 19 and been adored from the first, and who had never, not once, had cause to wonder whether her husband saw her or merely saw the space she occupied. Dorothea had grown up beside Judith the way a sapling grows beside an oak, not in resentment, but in the quiet understanding that the light fell differently on different branches. She had learned early that the second daughter's virtues were the quiet ones: patience, observation, the ability to enter a room without altering it. She had brought these virtues to her marriage like a dowry no one had asked for, and she had spent 2 years deploying them in a household that noticed her competence, but not her presence. She had not wept in front of him. She would not weep now. But she sat beneath the copper beech for a long time, watching the gardeners work the beds at the far end of the lawn, their movements small and methodical in the autumn light, and when Mrs. Prohl came to ask about the afternoon's linen delivery, Dorothea gave her instructions in a voice that did not waver. And Mrs. Prohl, who had been housekeeper at Branthwaite for 11 years and who understood far more than she was credited with, looked at the Duchess's face and asked no questions at all. Piers did not come to the garden. He sat at the breakfast table for some time after Dorothea left. His coffee went cold. The post remained unopened. Tregear returned once to ask about the drainage and saw his employer's face and withdrew without speaking. The ring sat beside the cup where Dorothea had placed it, and Piers looked at it the way a man looks at an old wound that has been reopened, not with surprise, but with the dull recognition that it has never, in fact, healed. He picked it up eventually. He turned it in his fingers. M.H. April 1811, Mary Holloway, who had laughed when he had fumbled the ring onto her finger in the Ashfield chapel because his hands were shaking. Mary Holloway, who had written him letters at his posting that smelled of lavender and were full of small domestic observations. The cat had caught a mouse, the garden wall needed pointing. She had learned to make a creditable gooseberry fool. Mary Holloway, who had been buried in the Ashfield churchyard 3 weeks before he knew she was dead, in a grave he did not visit for 2 years because visiting would have made it real. And Dorothea. Dorothea, who had married him, knowing only that he was quiet and wealthy, and that her father, Sir Rowan Innes, considered the match advantageous. Dorothea, who had come to Branthwaite as a bride, and set about understanding the house and the estate, and the tenants with the methodical patience of a woman accustomed to being given very little information and making the most of what she found. Dorothea, who had sat across from him at this table every morning for 2 years, and read him with a precision that he had mistaken for contentment, because it did not occur to him, it had not once occurred to him, that a woman who did not complain might still be paying attention. He had not told her about Mary, because telling her would have required him to explain not just the marriage, but the manner of it, the secrecy, the shame, the cowardice that dressed itself up as pragmatism. It would have required him to say, "I married a woman I loved and hid her, and she died while I was away, and I have carried her ring ever since, not because I am faithful to her memory, but because I am punishing myself for the ways I was not faithful to it while she lived." And it would have required him to face the question Dorothea had placed before him with the same quiet precision she had placed the ring beside his cup. What am I, if not a replacement for the woman you lost? He knew the answer. He had known it for months, perhaps longer, perhaps since the night last winter when he had come home late from the House of Lords and found Dorothea asleep in the library with a book open on her lap and the fire burned to embers, and had stood in the doorway watching her breathe and feeling something shift inside his chest that he could not name, because naming it would have required him to acknowledge that the life he was living with this woman was not the temporary arrangement he had told himself, it was but a real thing, a whole thing, a thing that deserved to be met with the same honesty he had failed to give to Mary. He put the ring in his pocket. He went to find Tregear. "The Ashfield Parish Register," he said. "I need to know if Reverend Holloway is still the curate there." Tregear, who had served 2 dukes and learned early that the best stewards answered questions without asking them, consulted his correspondence files and returned within the hour. Reverend Holloway had died in 1813. His daughter's grave was in the southeast corner of the churchyard. The current curate was a man called Threlfall. Piers sent no word to Dorothea. He did not go to the garden. He went to his study and sat at his desk and wrote 2 letters. The first was to the Reverend Threlfall at Ashfield, requesting that the grave of Mary Holloway be properly maintained and a stone erected if one had not already been placed. He enclosed funds sufficient for both and for a contribution to the parish poor fund in her name. The second letter he did not write immediately. He sat with the paper before him for a long time, the pen in his hand, the ink drying on the nib. Then he wrote 4 lines. He folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it on Dorothea's pillow before dinner. Dorothea found it that evening. She had dined alone, or rather, she had dined at the table while Piers sat at his end and neither spoke, the silence between them not hostile but heavy, the particular weight of 2 people who are aware that something has been broken and are not yet certain of the shape of its repair. She retired early. She went to her chamber. She saw the letter on her pillow. She opened it. It read, "You are not a replacement. You are not a continuation. You are the life I did not know I was permitted to want. I should have told you. Forgive me for the years I let you think you were living in an empty house when the truth is that I was the one who was empty." Dorothea read it twice. She folded it. She placed it in the drawer of her dressing table, beside the small painted miniature of her mother that she had brought from her father's house. She did not go to him that night. She went to him the next morning. She found him in the breakfast room, seated in his usual place, the coffee untouched as it had been the day before. The ring was not on the table. She sat down. She poured her tea. She allowed the silence to breathe for a full minute, long enough for him to understand that this was not an ambush, not a continuation of the previous morning's reckoning, but something else. "I read your letter," she said. "Yes." It was well written. A ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, not yet relief. "It took me 4 hours. 4 lines in 4 hours. I discarded 11 attempts." Dorothea took a sip of her tea. The morning light was the same as yesterday. Amber, warm, forgiving, in the way October light can be when it chooses. The fire crackled. Mrs. Prohl's footsteps passed in the corridor and did not stop. "I will not ask you to stop grieving her," Dorothea said. "I would not respect a man who could discard a dead wife's memory on request. But I will ask you this. Do not carry it in your coat pocket like a secret. Secrets corrode. You, of all people, should know that by now." He looked at her. The gray eyes that had been shuttered and guarded for 2 years were not shuttered now. They were open in the way a window is open after a storm has broken, not calm, not settled, but clear. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Bury it," Dorothea said simply. "With her, where it belongs. And then come home and tell me about her. Not because I require a confession, but because I am your wife. And a wife who does not know her husband's griefs cannot be expected to share his life." 3 days later, Piers rode to Ashfield. He went alone, departing before dawn while the house was still dark, and the only light came from the kitchen where the cook's boy was banking the stove. The ride was long, nearly 4 hours through country that grew flatter and quieter, as the Branthwaite hills gave way to the fens, the hedgerows thinning, the churches visible for miles across the level ground. He had not made this journey in 5 years. The last time, he had come in a closed carriage and had not stayed above 10 minutes. He found the grave in the southeast corner of the churchyard, beneath an elm that had grown large enough in the intervening years to cast shade across the stone that the Reverend Threlfall had arranged with commendable speed. It was a good stone, plain, well cut, bearing only her name and the dates, no epitaph. Piers had not been asked to supply one, and by the time he might have offered, the silence around her death had calcified into something he no longer knew how to break. He stood at the grave for a long time. The churchyard smelled of wet grass and old stone and the faint mineral chill of autumn earth. A blackbird sang from the elm. The sound was ordinary and therefore almost unbearable. He took the ring from his pocket and held it in his palm. The garnet caught the thin October light and held it, that dark, nearly black red that he had once compared, in a letter he never sent, to the color of sloe berries in the hedgerow behind the curate's garden. She had laughed at that, he remembered. She had said he was a terrible poet and a tolerable husband, and that she would keep both. He knelt. The ground was soft from recent rain. He pressed the ring into the earth at the base of the stone, working it down with his thumb until it was deep enough that no plow or passing foot would disturb it, and he stayed kneeling for several minutes, with his hand flat against the ground, his palm against the cold soil. And he said nothing because there was nothing left to say that had not been said already in 15 years of carrying her ring and failing to carry her memory with the honesty it deserved. Then he stood and brushed the soil from his knees and walked back to his horse. When he returned to Branthwaite that evening, he found Dorothea in the library. She was reading, or holding a book at least, though he suspected she had not turned a page in some time. He sat down in the chair opposite her. The fire was lit. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax and the faint sweetness of the dried lavender Dorothea kept in bowls on the side tables. He told her about Mary. He told her everything: the courtship, the secret wedding, the letters, the fever, the grave he did not visit for 2 years. He told her about the shame and the cowardice, and the way the ring in his pocket had become a kind of talisman, not of love but of guilt, a reminder of the specific ways in which he had failed to be the man he should have been. He spoke for a long time. Dorothea listened without interrupting. When he finished, the fire had burned low, and the candles on the mantel had guttered halfway down. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For trusting me with it. You should have done so 2 years ago, but you have done it now, and that matters." He looked at her across the dim room, this woman he had married because his mother had recommended her family and her temperament and her prospects, this second daughter of a country baronet whom he had assessed, on their wedding day, as pleasant and manageable and unlikely to cause difficulty. He looked at her and understood, with a clarity that felt like stepping into cold water, that he had been a fool of a very particular and very common kind, the kind who mistakes quietness for simplicity and composure for the absence of depth. "Dorothea," he said. "Yes?" "I should like very much to begin again. Not the marriage stands, but the manner of it, the way I have conducted myself within it." She closed her book. She set it on the table beside her chair. She looked at him with the steady, measuring gaze that he now understood was not compliance, but assessment, the look of a woman deciding, on the basis of available evidence, whether the man before her was capable of becoming what he claimed he wished to be. "Then begin," she said. He began. It was not dramatic. There was no grand gesture, no public declaration, no sweeping scene in a ballroom or at a dinner. It was granular and daily, and consisted of small acts of attention that, accumulated over weeks and months, amounted to a reformation so thorough that Mrs. Prohl commented on it to Tregear, and Tregear said nothing, which was his way of agreeing. He asked Dorothea about her mornings. He learned that she walked the south lawn at 7, regardless of weather, and that she preferred the copper beech in autumn and the walled garden in spring. He learned that she read poetry, not the fashionable verse everyone quoted at dinners, but older work, devotional and precise, the kind of poetry that rewards attention. He learned that she had opinions about the estate's tenancies that were more detailed and more practical than his own, formed through 2 years of quiet conversations with Mrs. Prohl and the wives of the tenant farmers during her afternoon calls. He learned that she had been lonely. That was the hardest thing. Not the ring, not the secret, not the buried marriage, but the loneliness. The understanding that she had lived in this house for 2 years as his wife and had been, in every way that mattered, alone. That she had eaten breakfast across from him every morning and been unseen. That she had managed his household and walked his grounds and slept in his bed and remained, throughout all of it, a stranger to him by his own negligence. He could not undo it. He could not recover the 2 years he had spent carrying a dead woman's ring while a living woman ate toast beside him with white knuckles and said nothing. But he could, and did, begin the work of learning her with the same painstaking attention she had given to learning him. By winter, Branthwaite had changed. Not visibly. The house was the same, the grounds were the same, the staff moved through their routines with the smooth efficiency Mrs. Prohl demanded. But the quality of the silence in the rooms where the Duke and Duchess sat together had altered. It was no longer the silence of 2 people occupying the same space. It was the silence of 2 people who had chosen to remain. Polly Wick noticed, of course. She noticed the way the Duchess laughed now at the breakfast table, not often, but occasionally, a sound Polly had not heard before. She noticed the way the Duke's riding coat, when she brushed it each morning, no longer carried anything in its left interior pocket. She noticed the way he paused in doorways when the Duchess was in the room, not to observe her covertly, but to see her, openly, deliberately, the way one looks at something one is no longer willing to take for granted. She mentioned none of this to Mrs. Prohl. Some things were better left unspoken. The noticing was enough. In the spring, Dorothea told Piers she was with child. She told him at the breakfast table, in the same chair where she had set the ring beside his coffee cup 6 months earlier. And she told him plainly, without ceremony, because that was her way. He set down his cup. He looked at her. She saw the gray eyes fill, not dramatically, not with the kind of decorative grief he had carried for 15 years, but with something simple and startled and new. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well. Is there anything you need?" She considered this. "I should like you to write to my father. He will want to know." Piers wrote to Sir Rowan Innes that afternoon. It was not a formal announcement, but a personal letter, 3 pages in his own hand, and when Sir Rowan received it at his house in Derbyshire, he read it twice, and then sat in his study for a long time looking at the fire, because the letter contained not only the news of the child, but an account, brief but unmistakable, of the kind of husband Piers intended to be, and Sir Rowan, who had worried quietly about his second daughter's happiness since the wedding, recognized in those 3 pages the sound of a man who had woken up. Their son was born in November of 1817, a year and a month after the morning of the ring. They named him George, after the brother whose death had made Piers a duke, and Rowan, after the grandfather who had raised Dorothea to notice what others overlooked. He was a healthy child, with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and from the day of his birth he was held and fed and spoken to with the combined attention of 2 parents who had learned, through the specific pain of nearly failing each other, what it meant to be present. On the anniversary of the morning Dorothea had set the ring beside his coffee, Piers came to breakfast and found a small parcel beside his plate. Inside was a ring, new, plain gold, with no inscription. It was accompanied by a note in Dorothea's hand. "This one is yours. It has no past. Wear it forward." He wore it. He wore it every day for the rest of his life, through the births of their 2nd and 3rd children, through the rebuilding of the South Wing, through the long winters and the noisy summers, and the particular domestic happiness that is available only to those who have earned it by facing the worst of themselves and choosing, deliberately and daily, to be better. The garnet ring remained in the earth at Ashfield. The elm grew over it. The grass covered it. And in the breakfast room at Branthwaite, where the October light came through the tall windows and turned the linen the color of warm cream, the Duchess poured her tea each morning, and her husband watched her do it, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of absence, but of presence, full and deliberate and chosen. They arrive here, like a ring set down where it cannot be ignored, whenever they are ready.